Anyways, okay, back to the subject of shifting the goalposts. Now, this is something that I've been accused of doing, all right? Or rather, Muslims in general have been accused of shifting the goalposts in regards to the topic of the preservation of the Quran.
So today we're going to look at the evolving doctrine of Quran preservation, and we're going to look at some specific Muslim leaders and their stances. So over here we have in red the more conservative Muslims. Then in purple you have Yasser Qadhi, who's trying to branch and bridge conservative and academic Islam. And then you have in blue some of the more progressive ideas. So let's start with Zakir Naik. So Zakir Naik is very conservative. Why? Because he doesn't even talk about the different qira'at and different ahruf. He just says there's one Quran and it's dot by dot preserved exactly the same to Muhammad. So that's a pretty dogmatic statement that most academics and more progressive Muslims would reject. But that's where Zakir Naik is. And that's what we call the ignorant stage for most Muslims, where they don't even know that the ahruf exist. Then you have Dawa Man, who's a pretty extreme Salafi, and his response is, yes, there are ahruf. We know about this. And he refers people to Abdul Rahim Hassan's playlist on this, where it does talk about that and explains the Quran through that lens. But he doesn't talk about the Sana manuscript. There's not a lot of engagement with the Sana manuscript in Dawa's man's teaching. And then you have Farid, Adnan Rashid, Ijaz, and Mansour. And I put them together because they all retweeted one response to the Sana manuscript, which was that the guy who wrote it had bad memory or maybe was using a bad recitation. And Haytham on Twitter, he rejected that with one or two tweets. But this is how they are trying to engage with Quran preservation. They're saying, yes, there's one Quran. The different ahruf, they explain everything. You don't need to worry about it. And when you see things like Sana manuscript that are very different than the Uthmanic text, well, maybe it's a guy with bad memory, and we're going to come up with different theories to explain that. Then you have Muhammad Hijab, who says, actually, those Sana manuscripts, you can find as many manuscripts as you want. It doesn't matter because they're all extra ahruf. They're all extra, basically readings that don't, that it's nice to have, but it doesn't matter because Allah preserved the one that he wanted through Uthman, and that's what we have, and that's what matters. So that's kind of Hijab's position. And he relies a lot on Dr. Khan's article in Yaqeen, which Yasser Qadhi said does not answer all the questions. Then you have Yasser Qadhi, and this is where it gets really interesting because Yasser Qadhi, as you can see, agrees with the age of Aisha, which is a sort of litmus test in how progressive or conservative you are in your interpretation of Islam. But he's in that awkwardness stage where he wants to hold on to this same doctrine, but he is aware of the historical problems that people like Shadi Nasser are bringing up. He knows about those. So he can't just say things like, oh, if you were to fill an empty book with the Quran, what would you fill it with? Oh, I'll just take Hafs and write it word for word, because he knows that that's not historically tenable. There's textual criticism and problems there that he's aware of, but he doesn't want to expose the average Muslim to that, of course. So he'll say things like, it's not an easy yes or no. And of course, now he said he's very comfortable with his view, but it's unclear what exactly that view is. So we're all very excited to see his book that's going to come out soon that addresses this. Then you have Shabir Ali, who's another person who's more Quran first, who recently changed his mind on the age of Aisha over the last 10 years or so, and now says that she's probably 19 or something like that. And his response to the sonnet is so fascinating. You guys should watch this video where he says, oh, well, back in the early times of the Prophet Muhammad, people were just getting the general idea, and it doesn't mean they were writing down the exact words. And later on, things changed. And so he just has this very interesting view where he's trying to accommodate for the historical problems and the holes, but he's also trying to hold on to a doctrine of the Quran that says the Quran is perfectly preserved. Same thing with Mufti Abu Layth and his friend Salim, and they're very much Quran first Islam, less hadith heavy, and that also means that they have a very kind of unusual view. Dr. Salim says that only the Hafs is preserved, that the Warsh and Dori and Susi and all the other readings are not actually the Quran. And so again, Dr. Van Putten and Dr. Haytham have a field day with this, really rejecting this strongly on Twitter and in responses to him. Then you have the Shiites who are super fascinating because they also have a very conservative view on Aisha, but they're very, very critical of the entire Sunni paradigm because their argument is, well, if what you say is true, then Uthman basically burned up to 6/7 of the Quran. How can you say that? How can you say that Allah's word was destroyed? And so you have this really fascinating critique of the entire Sunni narrative. And it's funny because you watch Shiites who talk about Yasir Qadhi, and they talk about how he struggles with this because they know that he knows the facts. And finally, you have Dr. Shadi Nasser here, who is looking at facts first. He doesn't care about the past narratives. He wants to know what actually happened. It's unclear what his stance on Aisha's age is. And of course, his response to the Sana manuscript is that there were companions with different mushafs, right? There were different variant readings, and there's a very complicated history of how the Quran was canonized. And that's what he talks about in his book, the variant readings of the transmission of variant readings of the Quran. And how would he fill a book with the Quran? Well, I mean, that's a good question. What is considered the Quran, and according to who? And of course, he had his interview recently where he talks about these things. So as you can see here, when Farid talks about moving the goalposts, it's almost comical because you can see in real time how Muslims themselves are changing the goalposts and how Muslims are finding new narratives and new ways to explain things like the Sana manuscript. How different Muslims would say, oh, Shabir Ali, he's outside of orthodoxy because of this. Or they would say, okay, he's wrong about this, but we can still accept him. He's not kuffar. He's not a non-Muslim. And this is so fascinating because if you accept Shiites as Muslims, if you say that this doctrine of Quran does not disqualify them as Muslim, then you're basically admitting that their doctrine of Quran might be wrong, but it's not a deal breaker, right? So if it's not a deal breaker, then why don't you just accept this view? Why don't you go with them? And then they'll say, well, it's just factually untrue. And that's where you can really engage and say, well, how open is this word preservation? What can be included when I say the Quran is preserved? What do you mean by preserved exactly? Because Dr. Naik has one view, Dr. Ali has one view, Yasir Qadhi has one view. So what exactly do you mean by the Quran is preserved? And that's why we're talking about the evolution of this doctrine, right? And that's why, again, when Farid says, David Wood is moving the goalpost, it's almost comical because you look at this and you see who's really moving goalposts here. It's clearly the Muslim scholars. They're moving the goalpost very obviously. And I think it's very important when we're talking about Islamic clarity to get accountability on this. Don't let people just say whatever they want and say, oh, this is what I said all along. Hold them accountable to what they've said and ask them for clarity on exactly what they mean. Thanks so much, guys, and I hope you guys have a great day. We'll talk about this more.